A bit of show news before we get to today's episode. Football Today is now on Patreon. What does that mean? That means that you can support the show financially and get some extra content that wasn't available to you before. Some of these new features include access to full unedited interviews with all of our guests, which is really cool. That means that if we do a 35-minute interview with Daniel Storey, that means you'll get to hear the full 35-minute interview, not the 20-minute interview that you might get in the episode. You'll also get access to one weekly bonus episode where John and I analyze one of the episodes from that week in greater detail. So we'll take you kind of behind the scenes and talk about how we made it, but also we'll talk about maybe some of the points that we didn't really get to address in the episode. And we'll also have some fun fan participation features where you can interact with us and interact with our guests. So check out all of that on patreon.com where it'll be in more detail. And lastly, we're really grateful for any financial support you can give us. This show is done independently and it takes a lot of time to produce, from editing the interviews to sourcing the music and the clips and tying it all together. So if you feel like the show has some value to you, please support it and we'll continue to make you great content. And if you don't want to, that's totally fine. We'll still continue to put out these episodes for free for your pleasure. Now, onto today's episode.
In the last few weeks, it feels like everybody is talking about wages in football.
I think that everybody needs to play their part in this national effort, and that means Premier League footballers too.
That was Matt Hancock, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care for the British government, suggesting that footballers should give up some of their wage in the fight against coronavirus. But it's not just footballers' wages that have come under scrutiny.
Particularly the amount of money they're actually going to be able to claim back. It's not sort of tens of millions, it's sort of 2 or 3 million, depending on how many of the staff have actually been furloughed. So, look, it's a PR disaster.
Across the Premier League, clubs have been coming under criticism for making use of a government furloughing scheme to save imbursing their lower paid staff. With more money than ever in football and less money than ever in the economy, people are asking questions about football's relationship with wealth.
They can keep this going.
Yeah.
They could easily continue paying their staff. They don't need to go to the government yet. It is not a desperate situation.
In this episode, we ask, why is everyone talking about wages in football? And how is football being used as, well, a political football?
Although this type of global pandemic probably couldn't have been planned for as far as football was concerned, it should be a wake-up call to the game.
Daniel Storey is a freelance journalist whose work can be found in the iPaper, BBC Sport and the Totally Football Show, amongst others.
It has existed in a very flimsy reality for far too long, and that flimsy reality is based partly, if not wholly, on the fact that everything is skewed towards the very top, which allows those clubs at the top to probably ride out pretty much everything, although the loss of broadcasting revenue would be potentially shambolic for them. But those at the bottom have existed for far too long on a hand-to-mouth, day-to-day, week-to-week basis, and anything that disrupts that basis is potentially catastrophic.
You wrote a piece in the iPaper last week titled "Tottenham's furloughing of staff was an act of moral vandalism that history will not forget." Could you explain to us what the furloughing scheme set up by the government is?
It seems to be a very off-the-hoof measure, but probably one of the best that they've come up with during this period of crisis, I think. Rather than companies lay off staff in redundancy action to save money, particularly those at a time when those employees no longer have enough work to keep the company afloat, they would produce a scheme whereby those companies could claim back 80% of the staff's wages. That was intended for those staff to therefore be put on what they've called a furlough scheme, and furlough seems to become the word of 2020, if not coronavirus. Some firms will top that up with a 20%, some firms won't, but the idea is that every member of staff avoids redundancy, and for a period of time, I think they've said at least 3 months, will be able to claim or rely upon 80% of their wages.
And how have Premier League football clubs been making use of it?
Well, Tottenham, the example I used in the column for the Eye, have made use of it and, as we stand, are not willing to top that up by 20%. Other clubs haven't, and I think there's an important distinction to make here, that the government's furlough scheme, although it was presented as a universal measure, was intended, I think, to be used by those companies for whom this period of lockdown and social distancing and dramatic economic downturn would be potentially catastrophic to them existing or continuing to exist as companies. I don't think that is the case for any Premier League club, and certainly no Premier League club towards the top of the league in terms of revenue and cash reserves. The reason I called it moral vandalism is that technically this is open to everyone, and there is nothing legally wrong with what Tottenham have done, but I think we live in extraordinary times, and extraordinary times call for different behaviour, and part of that behaviour I think needs to be to make decisions based not just on economic or business principles but on moral principles, and I think what Tottenham has done has gone completely against that.
Are there any examples of elite football clubs who have shown themselves to be above this form of moral vandalism?
Yeah, there are, and I think it probably should be said that from the ones we know at the moment, it's a majority. Manchester City and Liverpool have both announced that they will continue to pay staff throughout this. Manchester United did that from the get-go. You know, I don't think it's worth continuing to beat Liverpool having gone back on their decision, although the original one was dismal in my opinion. But the two Manchester clubs from the start have agreed to do what is morally right and should be applauded for that. It shouldn't be a cause of widespread celebration, in that it probably says more about our view of modern football and modern football super clubs that we feel the need to pat them on the back for doing the right thing, but it would have been easy, as we've seen from other clubs, to do the wrong thing, so good on them for that.
The reason why, as a Liverpool fan, Natasha, I'm upset is because the club wasn't built on this. And when I touched on Spurs yesterday, and the anger of a top six club doing this furlough is just incredible to me. I mentioned it on Spurs. Now I feel exactly the same way about Liverpool Football Club.
What do you make of the fan reaction to this so far?
At a horrible time, it's been pretty warming. Of course, if you scroll through social media, as I am prone to do and will chastise myself forever for doing, you can see fans whose tribalism blinds them to such an extent that they will not accept any form of criticism of their club, and it's a very blind loyalty, and that's pretty unhelpful. But I think in the main, fans of, I've seen many fans of Tottenham saying, this sits really badly with me. This will shape my decisions regarding my club moving forward. Probably only emotional decisions. I think fans will continue to support their clubs because football supporters by their very nature are a uniquely loyal customer. But I think it will shape their opinions of their club. One of the reasons that Liverpool have performed a U-turn on their own furloughing decision and have now agreed to pay staff in full is purely because of that reaction. Partly media, partly I suspect internal, and Jurgen Klopp is a very proud socialist, and I suspect he was pretty annoyed by the decision, although I can't believe he didn't know it was coming and couldn't have made points at that juncture. But it's also the fans' reaction. It's also the mass of Liverpool supporters who say, hang on a minute, you can't tell us that this needs more, and hashtag that as a slogan for our pursuit of glory under Jurgen Klopp, and then completely undermine those principles when fans and employees of the club need it most.
Yeah, one of the things that you point out in the piece that you wrote was that football clubs can rely on tribalism as a form of brand loyalty when it comes to these economic decisions. Do you think that we'll see any form of protest from fans over the way clubs act during the current crisis when football is back on?
I think this period of lockdown is, as I've said, extraordinary, and I also think it will change the way we view things. I think in a very purely practical term, it means that supporters are going to have less money to buy tickets, to travel to games, to buy merchandise, and football should not be arrogant enough to think it sits above those financial concerns because it could affect their own revenue. I honestly believe that as well as continuing to pay their staff, I think if players are to take a wage cut, then I think part of that should go to a pot for the supporters of that club to subsidise tickets and travel when football does come back, because football it likes to see itself as this bubble that sits above or aside from normal culture, but it cannot escape the realities of daily life in this country at the moment, which is a time of enforced austerity and financial hardship. So yes, I hope that football does accept its place in that, and I think if it doesn't, it's going to learn that lesson pretty quickly.
Assuming the government's furloughing scheme was disallowed to elite clubs, and I think there's some suggestion that it might be, given that there seems to be some sort of means testing behind it, would you say that the economic burden on football clubs should be borne by the players or the owners?
The owners every time, for me. I personally think footballers are getting a pretty bad lot out of this crisis in general, because politicians are minded to blame them because there is already a view of footballers as spoilt millionaires with nothing to spend their money other than fast cars and mansions. And to be honest, that's pretty categorically wide of the mark from my experience. So the billionaires have to take this on themselves. I understand that their own businesses may be affected by, their non-football businesses may be affected by the corona crisis, and that is probably true across all industry. But this is the time for them to step up. This is the time that their wealth matters. I think I'm right in saying that there are 15 billionaire owners or part owners in the Premier League of the 20 clubs, so they can afford to do the right thing here. I do agree that players should probably take a pay cut, but I don't think that should be enforced on them. I don't think they should be strong-armed into it, and I certainly don't think that they should be lambasted and derided by politicians who find it very easy to point the finger of blame at footballers, but not so easy to do it at other industries.
How do you think the players come out of this scenario?
I think by the end of it, they will come out of it very well. I think we will hear more and more about those players who perhaps normally don't really want their charitable or goodwill gestures to be shouted from the rooftops, but having come under attack from politicians and some elements of the media, I think it is in their best interests for them to shine light on what they've done, and good on them for doing so. The line we constantly hear about the coronavirus is that it's universal, that everyone's affected. We had news on Monday that Pep Guardiola's mother, for example, had passed away after complications. So nobody sits outside of this, and footballers will be affected as will anyone else. They do have generally an increased wealth, but that's only really true at Premier League level. And it's that grassroots and lower league level that we're seeing clubs who, while simultaneously fighting for their own lives, are also doing good by their communities with, implementing schemes for donating to food banks or delivery services. And yet we should shout that from the rooftop, because football does get a bad rep, and most of the time I think that rep is pretty unfair.
A lot's happened since you wrote your article. Most importantly, the Premier League met to discuss their coronavirus response.
A unified position was established among the 20 clubs that they would be recommending pay cuts or deferrals from their players amounting to 30%.
What do you think were the most notable things that came out of those meetings?
I think until now, the Premier League's most pressing concern has been to get football back. I understand that, because if broadcasters are threatening to pull revenue, then that potentially does undermine the economic viability, at least in the short term, of the product, and that would be a catastrophe for Premier League PR. So I get why, but I think over the last week there has been a realisation that, perhaps driven by public opinion, that football is beginning to matter less at the moment. It will still matter hugely when it comes back, because for some people, and very many people, it's an effective measure of their social normality. But football coming back in live form, with or without crowds, is not actually that important now. So I'm glad they've kind of pivoted to looking at schemes to help the game, whether it's lower league and grassroots, or whether it's charitable donations to the NHS. I'm glad to have seen that shift, because I think it needed to come. I think it should have come first. I think for too long they were worried about their own house and getting games in order, and I think that has now changed.
At the end of your article, you talked about the way that football will have to respond to a changing economic climate, and you wrote, "The COVID-19 crisis will cause a sea change in society. We will emerge from our homes with our priorities and perhaps even our morals altered forever. That will hopefully be reflected in a growing sense of community, but it will also be undermined by financial struggles that are likely to be exacerbated by future tax increases. Football must not be so arrogant as to believe it can sit above that social alteration." What is your gut feeling on this? Will football change, or is it easier to imagine the end of football than it is to imagine the end of capitalism?
Yeah, I don't think it will be the end of capitalism. When I talk about a sea change, I think that probably comes on an individual or community level. Now, any sea change in behaviour or attitudes from the population undoubtedly has knock-on effects for capitalism, but I don't think it will shift, the roots or the foundations of the capitalist movement. What I do think is it might force football clubs and companies to be a little bit more grateful for their customers. Football enjoys this almost unique ability to sit astride, pursuit, leisure, and very big business. It relies upon, as I've said previously, a uniquely loyal customer base, and for too long it has almost openly mocked and derided and exploited those supporters because they are ripe for that exploitation. And they are hugely loyal and they are hugely defensive of their clubs or their, in inverted commas, businesses. So I hope that it will cause a shift in thought that, hang on a minute, we rely on these fans. Maybe next time, or maybe now, we give a little back. Maybe we don't just take.
So that's what's been happening. But all this raises more questions about the way football is being used by the government to push a particular message about money and the responsible use of it.
I think that what's happened is that in some ways football in the UK has mirrored the development of a kind of Thatcherite ideology and policy programme over the last 40 years or so.
Will Davies is a professor in political economy at Goldsmiths, University of London.
You think of the Bosman ruling in the 1990s, which opened up the market to foreign players. You then also had the huge influx of money during the 1990s thanks to Sky and the massive expansion of sponsorship. But then another huge influx of money again with the introduction of the rights to the Premier League that were sold on a global level, and to China in particular, meant that the amount of money coming into the game was rising and rising, which was a reflection of changes in political economy, changes towards a more free market model, towards a more global model, and towards an idea that what someone deserves to earn is set entirely by the free market, so that there's really no limit to what is a reasonable income. What I think has also happened in return is that politicians have often used football and footballers and elite clubs as a kind of favoured example for talking about why the market is a good basis for the organisation of society, but also to point to some of the dangers and excesses of the market when footballers are seen to be hedonistic or greedy or too bling or whatever it might be. That's when the tabloid media and conservative voices descend on football and accuse it of being too materialistic or consumerist.
Last week you tweeted, footballers have long played an important ideological role in UK neoliberalism in making extreme wealth seem A, rare, and B, earned. Just for clarification, what do you mean by neoliberalism here?
Well, neoliberalism is a term that describes an ideology that developed over the course of the 20th century in universities and think tanks and amongst certain magazines and so on. But from the late 1970s onwards became the dominant set of ideas that structured how policies were made in the developed capitalist world, particularly led by Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the United States, which effectively said that markets and the price system of markets, that's how supply and demand end up setting the price of whatever it might be, whether it be energy or commodities or labour for that matter, that this is the best way in which to organise society. This is something that governments should aim to support in every respect possible. So neoliberalism is a faith in markets that goes beyond simply a view of them as performing an efficient economic function in distributing goods in certain areas, and becomes more like an overarching vision of how society should best be organised.
You also mentioned a Tony Blair quote about David Beckham in that same tweet.
Where's the justice in it?
When you say to me, where is the justice in that? The justice for me is concentrated on lifting the incomes of those that don't have a decent income. You know, it's not a burning ambition for me to make sure that sort of David Beckham earns less money.
How do you see footballers fitting into the narrative about neoliberalism in the UK?
That was an interesting example. I mean, that quote was when Jeremy Paxman interviewed Tony Blair in the build-up to the 2005 general election, which Blair won, although with a much reduced majority from the previous election. And one of the main criticisms of New Labour and of Blairism that had dogged the whole Blair movement since the mid-1990s was that they were too soft on wealthy people, that they didn't want to raise taxes on the rich, that they were too sympathetic to the rich, that Blair himself was friends with very wealthy people like Rupert Murdoch or whoever it might be. And this was Paxman voicing a very common criticism of Blairism, saying, why are these people allowed to earn quite so much money? Why are you not wanting to tax them more so as to pay for public services using that money? And also to keep a limit on inequality in society, because inequality under neoliberalism back to the 1970s has been rising quite sharply over the 1980s, 1990s and since. And I thought what was interesting about Blair's response was that although the question had nothing to do with football, nothing to do with sport, he immediately used David Beckham, who at the time was maybe the most famous person in the UK, as a reason to defend the fact that some people are entitled to earn very large sums of money. The fact that he turned to football was interesting in a couple of respects, because first of all, it's clear that footballers don't earn their money due to inherited wealth or due to the good fortune of going to top private schools or Cambridge and Oxford and so on. No one would question that David Beckham was a very naturally talented footballer. But they also are examples, I suppose, of what you might call ideologically a form of social mobility, that they tend to come from working class backgrounds than most rich people. It's also more multiracial than financial elites in the UK. So in some ways, if you wanted an example of a positive vision of what inequality and elite wealth looks like, you might turn to football, because you'd say, well, these people, they've earned their money because they've got very unusual skills, they've got very unusual talents, they've worked very hard over the course of their childhood and their early adult life, and they come from backgrounds where they weren't gifted this money, so of course they should be allowed to keep it. So in that sense, it becomes a kind of a moral justification for people keeping the wealth that is rightly theirs and not taxing it.
In your Twitter thread, you also mention the French economist Thomas Piketty, who, in your words, quote, points out how damaging the emphasis on talent has been in illuminating what happened to top incomes from the 1980s onwards. Most of the gains have been for managers of one sort or another, end quote. Can you talk us through this idea of talent in an economic sense?
I think one of the points I was trying to make when I wrote that was that it's also rather misleading as a explanation of why there is so much inequality in society. Because if you turn to the growing amount of economic analysis of inequality, which is led by the French economist Thomas Piketty, who has written a lot about this in the last 5-6 years, Piketty's work shows that most inequality in our society, most of the reason why there are super rich people living in multi-million pound houses in West London, is nothing to do with natural talent, celebrity culture, meritocracy. It's about senior managers, it's about CEOs, it's about people rising up in law firms, in banks and so on. That doesn't mean these people aren't skilled and aren't talented. It doesn't mean that they should somehow have their kind of wealth sort of snatched away from them. But the analogy between someone who's earning £2 million a year from becoming a partner of a large accounting practice or something like that and David Beckham is really not actually a very illuminating one.
Tony Blair and David Beckham, of course, are names from the past. Would you say that there's been a long history then of footballers being used as pawns in a wider political game in the United Kingdom?
Certainly, I think that's been the case. And I mean, there's been discussions of the way Raheem Sterling has been treated by the tabloids and by Piers Morgan in particular, and the way that certain footballers seem to always attract condemnation for the way they live their lives, because they become in some ways kind of icons of what is perceived to be bad, sometimes what is perceived to be good as well. Beckham himself was someone who was held up as being a great family man at certain points, not always, but so I think footballers have often, because they're so famous, because they attract so much interest, and because they cut through to people who aren't interested necessarily in politics or aren't necessarily interested in economics. Talking about footballers is a way often of being able to talk about society in both its positive and its negative ways more broadly.
Given the sacrifices that many people are making, including some of my colleagues in the NHS who've made the ultimate sacrifice, I think the first thing that Premier League footballers can do is make a contribution, take a pay cut, and play their part.
So when Matt Hancock came out last week and singled out footballers as having to play their part, how does this fit in with the government's previous narratives about high earners?
Well, I think what Matt Hancock was doing was referring partly to the fact that Premier League football clubs were talking about laying off some of their far less well-paid members of staff, and Tottenham in particular, this had come up. But I think that it becomes quite a helpful way of identifying potential bogeymen in this situation. Because, I mean, most of the extreme concentrations of wealth that we now have in our society are mostly nothing to do with football. And they're mostly nothing to do with sport. And they're mostly nothing to do with celebrity culture. They're mostly to do with changes in the structure of our economy. And even, I think, Wayne Rooney, in response to these comments by Hancock, has now tweeted, and others like Gary Lineker as well, saying, well, why aren't we talking about bankers? Why aren't we talking about CEOs and hedge fund managers and so on? So I think that it was another situation where it was easy to point the finger at people who were perceived to be quite bling, as being into cars, being into money, being greedy, being selfish, that in that sense footballers ended up becoming a sort of voodoo doll, I suppose, for certain moral accusations against aspects of capitalism that are perceived or can be usefully portrayed as being unworthy and not having a social conscience. One of the things that Rooney accused Hancock of in return was trying to divert attention away from the government's handling of the crisis, because I think people know that as soon as you turn attention towards the Premier League and towards individual footballers, immediately the headlines and particularly some of the tabloid newspapers will focus on that because they become a kind of a lightning rod for attention. People are always hungry to talk about football and footballers in a way that someone like Piketty talking about managers and CEOs and the City of London and so on, a lot of people's eyes glaze over in comparison. So it's likely that Hancock knew what he was doing if he was trying to push attention elsewhere.
So do you think the politicians have overplayed their hand here? Or do you think that this deflection of the attention onto footballers will work well as a PR move?
There's been quite a lot of pushback against it. The best thing you could say in the government's defence is that it's a simple and accessible way that people can grasp a message that it's now time for the privileged and the rich to start putting a bit back. But they could have started talking about what was going to happen to taxes on top incomes and on wealth, which after all, footballers pay as much as anybody else. They could have started talking a bit about, the broader sense in which society needs to pull together. And I think that it didn't really get much take up. I mean, I don't know whether they were hoping that immediately there would be the voices of people like Piers Morgan and some of the sort of voices within the media that have routinely been rather critical of football's materialism. I didn't see that it actually had much of a positive effect. And the fact that people like Rooney and Lineker immediately pushed back against Matt Hancock, I think suggests that actually that line didn't really work.
Do you think that this pandemic then has deflated the myths about money that underpin our ideas about modern life?
What this pandemic has done is that in lots of ways people have realised that the price that the market values people's work at is actually not necessarily the best way of capturing and representing that value. So the most obvious ways in that's emerged is in relation to things like nurses' pay, which has been a kind of, there's been many people on the left and some on the right who have thought that nurses' pay should have risen over the last 10 years. Then people think about, people working in retail at checkouts, people working in the postal services, people who are sweeping the streets, people who are basically having to carry on working, putting their health at risk while someone else looks after their kids, who have, as far as the market's concerned, are some of the least valuable members of society. Meanwhile, you've got people who might be working, advertising or consulting or whatever it might be, who can do bits of their work from home or simply kind of, not do very much work for a bit, who are valued by the market far more highly. That ideological shift that occurred after the 1970s that I termed neoliberalism, I think has, at least for the time being, I'm not saying that this is going to be a permanent shift, we'll see, but I think that idea that market prices are the best way in order to value things is currently in grave crisis. Now, whether that same sense of scepticism towards the market will also be pushed towards the fact that a certain footballer might be earning hundreds of thousands of pounds a week. Now, I think hundreds of thousands of pounds a week is excessive for anyone. No one needs that much money. But I think that there is now a space has opened up, which may close down again, of course, in which it is possible to have a critical discussion about why is someone who is basically keeps society functioning and keeps doing so even in the face of health risks being paid less than £20,000 a year, while people on whom actually society doesn't depend at all might be earning 80,000 or far more than that. Where do these differentials come from? Of course, societies need differentials. They need to have ways of saying that this person has made a bigger contribution than this person. I think any society will have aspects of that. But I think that question of what is a sufficient difference between the top and the bottom and where should different types of contributions sit on that scale, I think that discussion can happen now in a way that doesn't immediately paint someone as a socialist or as an anti-capitalist. It actually now has come to seem quite reasonable to have some of those discussions.
You can read Daniel Storey's writing about football at the iPaper, BBC Sport, and listen to him on the Totally Football Show. Will Davies is Professor in Political Economy at Goldsmiths, University of London. This episode was produced by Josh Schneider-Weiler and Hugo Chambray. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoyed this podcast, why not subscribe to our Patreon, where you can get a host of unique bonus material. Or, if you can't spare the money, why not help out by sharing an episode with a friend? See you next time.